Sheldon here with CFI Pro Courses, and we're about to take our training to the next level by talking about endorsements today. So we've talked about the fundamentals of instruction and what it takes to be a flight instructor and all the many roles that we have. And we've also talked about how we do our job as a flight instructor, aka 14 CFR Part 61 of the regulations. So today we're going to talk about how we use those regulations to document and to endorse people for things such as a flight that we do, as well as any type of certification, initial pilot certification, and advanced pilot certification, and additional aircraft and class ratings. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's open up your PTS, and we're going to scroll down a little bit here. I'm going to hit the search feature here. And what we want to do is look for the spot where it talks about endorsements. And it's right here, Area of Operation 2, Task, Mic, Logbook Entries, and Certificates Endorsements. And this particular one here, the Section 2, Task, Mic, goes hand in hand with this Area of Operation 3 Task A. So I'll do one video that's over Task Mic, and then I'll do another video over Area of Operation 3 Task A, which goes along right with this one in the oral portion of the check ride. Normally when examiners ask about Task Mic, they normally overlap it with Task A. Probably not on purpose, but it actually does happen that way. So let's look and see what we have for required logbook entries and endorsements. And I'll make this a little bit bigger on your screen here so we can see what's going on. You won't have to strain your eyes. So it looks here that we have, looks like we have your Task Mic, logbook entries, and certificate endorsements. And this is referencing 14 CFR Part 61 and the advisory circular 6165, whichever the most current one is at the time of you watching this video. Right now, I think it's currently, well, I know it's currently sitting at 6165 Hotel. That's the current one, but you never know. It could change tomorrow. The objective here, to determine that the applicant exhibits instructional knowledge of the elements related to logbook entries and certificates and endorsements by describing. Now, remember that on your practical test, you won't be having the DPE specifically say, teach me a lesson on endorsements. That's not going to happen. That's probably never happened. I don't think it is. Normally, the way the DPE would give you, or the examiner, excuse me, would give you a scenario, and you would have to solve the scenario. And we'll talk about some scenarios as we get closer to the end of this. But let's look at the very first one that we have here. The first one is required logbook entries for instruction given. Now, this is going to come from two different places. One of them is going to come from 14 CFR 61.51. Now, 61.51 is going to be the reg which talks about how to fill out logbooks. And you just go step by step. It tells you like how to log dual training, how to log IFR, and so on and so on. So 61.51 tells you, the instructor, how to fill out a logbook. But it says required logbook entries for instruction given. So whenever you give instruction per 61.189 of Part 61, it says that whenever you give ground or flight, you have to endorse the logbook of the person that you're doing that for. So there are two regs in recap for this. 61.51 tells you how to sign the logbook or how to fill out the logbook. And 61.189 says that you must sign the logbook of every person that you give ground or flight instruction to. And I think probably the most important thing to understand when we are going over this is that you want to be able to endorse someone correctly. If you look at a logbook and how it's filled out, you can see here that we have a line of a logbook here. And what you can see here is that if you look over the line of the logbook, you just fill out every single part, but at the end it talks about the remarks. In the remarks section, it's best to put exactly what you did, and then of course sign it, put your CFI number, and then the expiration date of your CFI. But the biggest thing is, how do we put the remarks in there? What do we have to put? Well, if I went out and I did takeoff and landings, rectangular course, turns around a point, and S turns across road, I could actually just put all that in there. I could put rectangular course, comma, turns around a point, comma, S turns across road, comma, takeoff and landings, comma, and I could get even more specific about the takeoff and landings. There's really not a need to go into that much detail. The best thing to do, and let's say that the instance here that I'm working on is I'm trying to solo someone in a single engine airplane. So I would go to 14 CFR 61.87D, and that's everything I've got to do for an airplane single engine solo. And if you look there, what you can see is we're given 15 different things that we can do during that pre-solo training. And we talked about earlier doing the takeoff and landings, and we talked about doing some ground reference maneuvers. So the alternate way to do it would be training per 6187D, and then in parentheses you would put 3,12. And your expiration date. And if you have a really crappy signature, you may want to consider actually writing your name in print so that way someone can actually see who the instruction was given by. A lot of the times I would look at logbooks as an examiner and I couldn't read the name, and I probably a lot of the times couldn't read the CFI number, and that's not really good because it says in 6151 that thou shalt write it legibly. So there's actually a regulation requirement that you must sign the logbook and fill the logbook out where it's actually legible. Okay, let's go on to number 2 here. Number 2 states the required pilot certificate endorsements, including appropriate logbook entries. Now, first off here, because this is kind of an outdated, they try to make the PTS updated, but it's really not. It's actually kind of outdated. Specifically because it says required student pilot certificate endorsements. This is something that's prior to February of 2016 when the FAA did away with the student pilot paper certificate. So back then it used to be on a yellow type of paper and it had a front and back. The front said the certificate, which normally was a joined end on the medical. So it would say like FAA third class medical and student pilot certificate. It was actually 2 certificates in one. And it actually was something that you could actually get issued to you separately. So you could have a medical in one hand and a student pilot certificate in the other that was both paper. And on the back of the student pilot certificate, it offered spaces for the CFI to be able to sign for a solo authorization and to be able to sign for a cross-country authorization. It's not that way anymore. We don't endorse student pilot certificates. So if I had to say like something to do here, I would say that I would probably be able to just delete this word here and require called and say required student pilot endorsements, and you probably wouldn't even have to put the word including. You would say required student pilot endorsements, appropriate logbook entries, because it's just in the logbook. We don't actually sign the student pilot certificates anymore because they're plastic and it would be kind of hard to sign them. So we all do the regulations changed in February of 2016, and it went on to say a logbook endorsement versus endorsing the medical. So the ones that this would be everything that you have to solo a student. Now the bare bones minimum to solo a student would be, and I've got a little acronym that I use here. I call it Tim Loves Bacon, and that's what I use to solo a student. So the very first thing I have to think about is the acronym TIM, and TIM stands for TSA endorsement, your IACRA to get your student pilot certificate, and medexpress.gov or medexpress.fa.gov, and that's to get your medical. But the TSA endorsement is actually a required endorsement that must be made. You can take a look at it there on the screen. There's your TSA endorsement. And then the next endorsement would be your 61.87 Bravo, Charlie, and November, respective in that order. And this is everything being fair and equal. No solo at night, no solo in a complex or high performance or high altitude aircraft or anything like that. Everything being equal, just a plain Jane 172 or Archer or whatever you're soloing in, just a plain single engine aircraft, that would be Tim Loves Bacon. And so that's your TSA IACRA medical and your 61.87 Bravo Charlie and November, where Bravo is your pre-solo written authorization or your pre-solo test. Your Charlie is saying that you've done all the maneuvers and procedures that you have to do, which in this case for single engine would be 6187D. And then the statement that the flight instructor has gone over all the limitations that are applicable for the student pilot, and that's called 6187 November. So everything being equal, that's what it would be. And you could go a little bit beyond that with doing the 6187 Oscar if the person's going to solo at night in the local area. You could do a 6187 Papa if the person's going to go beyond 90 days, and you would need to re-endorse them again for another 90-day period because the 6187 November is only valid for 90 days. So after that 90 days, you would give a Papa. And then you have your 6193 endorsements for cross country, and the only one that's authorizing solo for that one would be your 6193 Charlie 3, which authorizes you to go solo beyond 50 nautical miles. There are two other ones that you would use for a student pilot for solo, and that is some very rare instances. One of them is if you want to authorize a student to go back and forth to an airport that is within 25 nautical miles of the home airport for the sole purpose of takeoff and landings, then you could give them a 6193 Bravo 1 endorsement, and you can take a look at it there. And then we have the 6193 Bravo 2 endorsement, and that allows someone to do repetitive cross countries less than 50 nautical miles back and forth as much as they want. And that's the 6193 Bravo 2. And so the requirement would be that you've got to do a lot of training with them and do pretty much everything within 6193 Charlie, Charlie 1 and Charlie 2 respectively, to give them the Bravo 2. Bravo 2 is a pretty complex endorsement, and it would take a lot of work to be able to get them a Bravo 2. Let's skip right down through here, and if I go too fast, or if you have any questions about what I'm doing, as loyal Patreon members, you can just post your question right down below, and I'll answer anything you need to ask about this. As we go through, we'll go through this one, we'll go through the next one, then I'll do another one just based off scenarios alone that a DPE would ask in a check ride. So that's what our November is set up for, is to get all these endorsements for November, to get all this training out of the way for endorsements. The next one is called preparation of a recommendation for pilot practical test. So you're sending someone to a check ride on this one, including the appropriate logbook entry for initial pilot certification. So initial pilot certification means the person doesn't have a pilot certificate, and they are getting their very first one. So that would be either a sport pilot, recreational pilot, or a private pilot. Initial pilot certification could not be commercial pilot. So the initial pilot certification would be either the sport, recreational, or the private. And there is respective regulations for each one of those. You have your respective regulation for sport, for recreational, and for private. I think these are pretty easy. You would simply just go to your 6165 advisory circular, and you turn into the appendix in the back, and you would simply just go to the section that deals with the pilot certificate that you're trying to accomplish. Like, for instance, we can see here that if I go to the sport pilot, there's everything relating to the sport pilot. You would just pick your endorsements that you need to endorse them for the check ride. And then you can see here, there's the ones for the recreational pilot. And you can also see there's the one for the private pilot. Now, some of these you have to read because it can be kind of confusing if you don't actually read them. Like, for instance, if you can see right here in the private pilot endorsements, if you're looking at your Alpha 33 endorsement, if you didn't read that, you would not get that you actually had to include the Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 endorsement. Now, the Alpha 1 endorsement, of course, is given for any check ride. It doesn't matter. As long as there's a flight portion involved, the Alpha 1 is always part of the check ride. And the Alpha 2 is only if they don't make a passing score of a 100 on their knowledge test. So if your student did not make a 100, you would have to give the Alpha 1, Alpha 2, 32, and 33. If the person made a 100, then you would only give the Alpha 1, the 32, and the 33. And the Alpha 1 says they're qualified to take the test, and the Alpha 32 was your endorsement to have them take the knowledge test, and your Alpha 33 is stating that you've trained them for all the maneuvers and procedures in 61107, and they meet all the time requirement of 61109. And so that would be the initial pilot certification endorsements there. So if the examiner says, which endorsements do I need? You'd pull out your advisory circular and you'd point right there to private pilot and you'd say, these are the ones that I'm going to give for the private pilot practical test. Right there as it says, right there, pilot practical test, recommendations, that's what you would give. Now, what if I'm going to do an additional pilot certification? So the pilot already has a certificate. It could be that they already have a sport, that they already have a recreational, that they already have a private, and you're wanting to do something in addition to that. So if they had a sport and went a recreational, you would just go to the advisory circular and point right to the regs, because that's an additional pilot certification. If you go to, if you're a private pilot, want to get a commercial pilot, then you would turn to the commercial pilot section of the advisory circular, and those are the ones. Again, don't forget there on the where you see Alpha 34 and 35, you see in 35 where it says don't forget to give the Alpha 1 and Alpha 2, and of course the Alpha 2 is only applicable if they didn't make a 100 on their practical test. So additional pilot certifications, meaning that they already have a pilot certification, they're wanting to get an additional pilot certification, and you are going to do that by going to the advisory circular and showing them the endorsements that you would give. Now, the additional aircraft qualification is something that is a little bit different here. We're not really talking about preparation of a recommendation. We're talking about the logbook entries. So if we're going to prepare someone for a logbook entry for this, then this is a little bit different. Meaning that I've had like an airplane, but now I want rotorcraft, or vice versa. Or I have an airplane single engine C, but now I'd like to have airplane single engine land, then I would do that. This would be additional aircraft qualifications. So I want to be able to fly a different type of aircraft, and I need the additional training. Now this training comes from 14 CFR 61.63, and 6163 Bravo would be for an additional category, and 6163 Charlie would be for an additional class. Now you can go back into my regulation videos and actually see how that is done. I don't want to go over that information again. Just go back to the regulation videos that cover 6163, and you can see how an additional category or an additional class is done, how the training's done there. But in this particular one, all we're simply going to do is go to the advisory circular, and we're going to turn all the way to the back there, this alpha number here, and you can see this is the appropriate endorsement to give for an additional aircraft qualification. It doesn't matter. You can see here in the header, it doesn't matter whether it's an additional category or additional class. It's the same endorsement for each. And of course, because it's a practical test, you need to give the Alpha 1, and you need to give the additional aircraft qualification endorsement here, which is your Alpha 74. And then there may be, if you did any soloing during that time for this person, and they weren't rated to solo the aircraft, then in accordance with 61.31 Delta 2, you would have to give your Alpha 72 endorsement. Now, assuming someone did not solo the aircraft, then you would need to give the Alpha 1 and the Alpha 74. Assuming that someone had to solo the aircraft and you gave them permission to solo the aircraft, then you would have to have given them an Alpha 72 endorsement, and therefore 3 total endorsements would be at a minimum. And this would not include anything like a complex, high performance, or any of those other type of an additional authorizations to fly the plane. So those are basically all the endorsements that you would give for this practical test. There's really not a lot more than that. There is some other ones like the next one we're going to talk about, which is a flight review, and then that will be basically all the endorsements. And number 4 states the required endorsements for a pilot logbook for the satisfactory completion of an FAA flight review. And again, if the examiner, the questions they like to ask is, what if the person flies with you and you don't want to give the flight review to them? What would you do? Then you would say, no endorsement needed. I just signed their logbook for instruction given, and I ask them to come back out, maybe participate in the Wings program with me, but get them proactive and get them back in. Well, I'll save that for the scenarios when I come back on another video. But for the required endorsement for this, again, we just go to our trusty advisory circular 6165. We turn all the way to the back there, and you can see there is the endorsement right there for the flight review, and we don't really need to go beyond that. That's says required endorsement of a pilot logbook for the satisfactory completion of a FAA required FAA flight review. There's the endorsement. There's the answer to number 4 right there. You'd also need to sign their logbook because you gave them instruction as well. So you probably want to say there's kind of 2 endorsements needed, the endorsement for the flight that you gave and the endorsement for the flight review that you gave. And that's it. Number 5 here is required flight instructor records. And required flight instructor records are in accordance with 14 CFR 61.189, and that is basically stating that if you are going to do any training, ground, or flight, you have to sign the logbook, and underneath there, 3 separate places where it says you have to keep a record of any solo, so the person's name, the date of the solo, and then what type of solo that you authorized, like was it a 6187 November? Was it a 6187 Papa? Was it a 6187 Oscar? Was it a 6193 Charlie 3? What kind of solo did you authorize? And then the next thing, because it's a total of 3, so we talked about the first one, which is solo. The next one is any knowledge test that you signed someone off for. You got to keep a record of that. Name, the type of test, the date the test was taken, and the results of the test. And you just need to put pass or fail. Don't need to put a grade in there or anything. That's not required. And then the third thing that we have is any practical test that you endorse someone for, and you would just need to give their name, the type of test, the date, and then results of the practical test, whether it be a pass or a fail. So this is it for this. I'll let you look back over this as much as you want. And the next time we meet, we're going to go over the Area of Operation 3 Task A, and that's going to get a little bit more detail about the training that's actually required for this. Remember that I told you that this kind of DPEs kind of overlap this and they really don't know that they are? This is only asking for logbook entries and endorsements. It's not asking for any different, for any type of training. So that's what's actually located in the other one. But no worries, nobody can do this stuff perfect. But if you follow me, I can pretty much get you darn near perfect. Anyway, thanks again for joining me. Todd Shellnut for CFI Pro Courses. Bye-bye.